Hey everyone.
Good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to the fifth episode of Yellow Talks. My name is Alex. I'm the Yellomind Kenya partner. Thrilled to be your host for today's session. Thank you for joining us. Whether you attend live or watching the replay, we truly appreciate your time, your engagement, and the trust you place in Yellowmind to bring you meaningful, practical, and actionable insights for your organization. At Yellowmind, our mission is simple: help organizations navigate complexity and turn strategy into measurable business outcomes. We launched YelloTalks to stay close to our community and address the real challenges faced by executives, risk professionals, and transformation teams. Each episode focuses on a topic that truly matters, from project management and enterprise architecture transformation and data governance. We are diving into a domain that is critical yet often misunderstood: governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC. Let's start with a question many executives ask, sometimes quietly in boardrooms. We have governance, risk, and compliance programs, risk registers, and compliance controls. So why do unexpected risks still hit our business? Organizations implement frameworks, run audits, and invest in tools, yet risks still materialize. Compliance becomes a checkbox exercise, and business teams remain disconnected from the business processes designed to protect them. The issue is not the lack of governance, risk, and compliance initiatives. The real problem is that governance, risk, and compliance is often fragmented, reactive, and disconnected from business architecture. That's why today's episode is titled Why Governance, Risk, and Compliance Programs Fail to Protect the Business, and How Architecture-Driven Governance, Risk, and Compliance Changes the Game. At the heart of this challenge lies architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance. A framework that integrates governance, risk, and compliance into enterprise architecture, turning governance from a static obligation into a strategic, proactive, and decision support capability. Without this integration, even the most sophisticated governance, risk, and compliance programs struggle to deliver real value. But when done right, governance, risk, and compliance becomes a powerful tool for visibility, accountability, and resilience. In enterprise architecture and governance, risk, and compliance solutions. Their architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance approach, ADOGRC, helps organizations connect risks, controls, processes, and systems in a unified architecture, providing real-time visibility, traceability, and actionable insights. BOC organizations anticipate risk, strengthen compliance, and make moving governance, risk, and compliance from a reactive obligation to a strategic enabler of business resilience. At Yellowmind, we are proud to collaborate with BOC Group to help organizations implement architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance at GRC and drive meaningful business outcomes. Today, we are honored to welcome an exceptional expert, Pablo from BOC Group. a leading authority on architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance, who has helped organizations worldwide modernize their governance, risk, and compliance programs and integrate them with enterprise architecture to protect and accelerate business value. Pablo, thank you for joining us today. We're excited to learn from your experience and explore how organizations can rethink their governance, risk, and compliance approach and move from fragmented risk management to architecture-driven resilience.
Thank you.
Pablo, many organizations invest heavily in governance, risk, and compliance frameworks, risk registers, and compliance tools, yet risks still materialize. And compliance often becomes a and compliance programs fail to deliver real business protection.
Yes, thanks, Alex, for the introduction. Thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's dive a little bit into GRC and how we at BOC Group with ADOGRC tackle this, right? So to answer your question, why there is traditional programs or traditional approaches that have failed, one of the main reasons for GRC initiatives to fail is simply the disconnection that exists very often. There is different teams using different sets of tools and mechanisms in order to accommodate a specific region or specific functionality or specific thing they try to do, but it stays disconnected from business, it stays disconnected from IT. So it's not just about having the risk itself somehow documented, maybe in an Excel spreadsheet, but also having a clear understanding of where it's connected. Is it connected to certain business assets, certain processes perhaps, IT-related assets? How are we managing or mitigating those risks? So it's not just the in itself risk or in itself control, but it's this holistic view that needs to be considered in a greater extent, right? So with that in mind, also compliance is sometimes looked as a burden, but not as a potential sort of like a dynamic improvement in the business. So at the end of the day, we're each very often in this local kind of like spectrum with my assets, my tool, my approach, but not having this visibility, this real-time traceability across the organization. And all of this obviously leads to bad integration between the systems. And because of lack of integration, we technically and also practically very often encounter kind of like a reaction. It's things happen too late when something already falters or goes wrong. So we want to go more into a proactive approach. With that, we have to understand better what we have in front of us. Yes. So.
Okay. So the problem is not the absence of controls, but the lack of structure, context, and actionable insights. Can you explain what architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance really is and how it addresses the limitations of traditional governance, risk, and compliance?
Mm-hmm. So to go a little bit more in detail, it's often, as we said before, very, very silo-driven. And architecture-driven obviously takes into consideration that we consider the whole architecture, right? So we have to understand our application landscape. We have to understand our process landscape. We have to understand different areas that, in a way, are very much impacted by risks occurring or maybe risk not being mitigated as they should, right? So we are going to, as we'll see also a little bit later in the demo, have a clear cut and a clear approach as to showing how these different scenarios are connected so that all the different stakeholders, people involved understand. And from there also have a better decision-making ability because the contextualization is clear and impacts that might happen to the business side of things. I maybe as a risk manager am better able to also accommodate and understand. So it's not just the architecture-driven approach as a context of having the assets connected, but also the stakeholders, all the teams involved, all the people involved, and having a communication between them in a more driven approach, so that the tool also, and ADOGRC helps then also to drive this architecture, this collaborative approach of governance, risk, and compliance.
That makes sense. Now let's see how this actually helps the business. Executives often ask, how will this impact business outcomes and reduce risk?
Good question. So let's put it this way. So there's many risks, right, that can happen. There is a lot of potential mitigation measures that you could implement, but all people have so much time and so much budget, right? So it's important to have a good understanding of which ones are critical, which ones of my risks have a high impact. So very often you would start off with an approach in which you just generally get a hold of all the potential risks that occur, but then you go in and you categorize them, you prioritize high impact risks. By identifying those high impact risks, you're then better capable of understanding these risks in more detail, and then also what type of impacts they have towards the other assets, such as business assets or IT-related assets, which will go back into being able to then collaborate and communicate with the corresponding asset owners, perhaps, or also other stakeholders. So in the end of the day, we want to reduce this kind of like operational, time-consuming approach of reacting to things that might happen, to having a set of clear-cut priorities. These are the things we need to concentrate on. These are the risks we need to concentrate on. These are the mitigation measures we want to have. Let's have the tool run workflows and involve the corresponding stakeholders, the corresponding asset owners, maybe a process owner, risk managers, to give feedback, to give their part of their knowledge that they have regarding the risk or regarding the control. At the end of the day, we get all these collaborational approaches and features. They get tracked in our tool. They get shown. We can better understand how certain trends are happening. If, for instance, a certain risk is prioritized because it has a high impact, but we see that our control is really not working because it's not being executed, then we can make an informed decision on working on that particular mitigation measure and not kind of like out of the blue shoot into things. All of this, obviously, the documentation of what has been done, what has been mitigated, or what has been checked, what has not happened, we then have clearly documented and visualized in our tool that then allows us also to essentially have a more traceable evidence and have also from there also new potential initiatives that we can initiate in order to improve our overall risk management, our overall GRC functionality. So at the end of the day, we want to align not just risk management, but also control management and other areas with our business strategy to have a more resilient approach.
Great. But every organization faces practical challenges when implementing governance, risk, and compliance. From your experience, what are the common obstacles organizations encounter when moving toward architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance?
Yes. The main points I would say here is, as we in the initial question also had, very fragmented data spread out across different places, causing silos to happen. With that, we have a limited understanding of the overall architecture, enterprise architecture, business architecture, and the impacts that our risks, for instance, might have on those assets. Other areas where very often we face challenges are resistance, for instance. Obviously, new tools or new mechanisms might be like a thorn in the eye, essentially. People might be saying, well, we used to do it this way, let's do it why not continue? It's about putting things in perspective. What have we currently been able to achieve with our current structure, and how is it going to be then improved if we, for instance, implement ADOGRC, a GRC platform that's integrated and, very importantly, also centralizes the assets. So we have this common repository, this common place where our business people will have their processes, our IT people have their applications, their application services, and risks, controls, initiatives, compliance. All of these assets and elements are then in this one platform, meaning that it's transparent to everybody. If there's changes to a certain process, for instance, it's traceable and clear to everybody. Then also it allows me, maybe as a control ICS responsible, to have a better understanding of how the risk is being currently impacted or assessed within the corresponding process. So at the end of the day, it's a lot about making a picture of how potentially in the future things could run better because of a lack of these issues that we mentioned, isolated approaches, and also a lack of transparency at the end of the day, right? Yeah, so these are definitely some of the main challenges. In ADOGRC, we try to definitely have a very visual approach. We also have some kind of like table listing structures, but very often the visual approach is quite pleasing, and seeing trends, seeing graphs, colors, all of this is something that we in ADOGRC try to implement so as to make the experience for the end users essentially also quite straightforward. Yeah. I'm not sure, but Alex, looks like you're not in the call anymore. Give me a hint, you're still there. Maybe there's a connectivity issue. Okay. Interesting, I cannot see you or hear you. So I'm not able to see or hear you currently. Okay, I'm not able to hear you or see you, so I would, oh, there you are. Now you're popping up again. There you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Nice to have you back, Alex.
Thank you for the talking points. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. Yeah, I had us. Yeah, thank you for the talking point on what are the main challenges, which I think prioritize.
I kind of like got your question a bit there, as the connectivity seems to be a bit off there, but so you asked about what should organizations considering a tool, a GRC tool, prioritize? That was your question?
Yes, that was the question.
Okay. Okay.
For organizations considering a GRC, what should they prioritize?
I see. Yeah. It's good. Also a good question. So obviously we, as I mentioned quite a few times, we want to make sure that it's not an isolated approach, right? Not just looking at the risk itself and saying, I'm going to do my part. I don't care how the IT landscape is looking like or the business landscape is looking like. So we want to have a good integration and an easy integration between business, IT, and GRC. This is one thing that I feel like ADOGRC really does a good job on. So this we'll also see in a moment. You can very easily connect these areas. Also, some of the things that you also need to consider are making it easy for the end user. So as I mentioned before, visualizations are important, graphs or some type of chart, some type of trends. These things are at the end of the day, as a kind of like resulting mechanism, important to make it an easy approach also, especially in the beginning, right? Obviously, if things are going in a workflow structure. So we run workflows with ADOGRC to get a current assessment of a risk, to get the status of a control execution and so forth. And these results should be then also visualized, or they should be trackable, right? So people need to see where is currently the assessment of the different risks that we have. How is it running currently, right? In the context of these workflows, it's important then to also consider how does the tool help me? How does the tool alert me to certain issues, like a potential threshold has been reached, or maybe an assessment was not doable, or an execution of a control was not doable because of a certain problem on site, let's say, right? So it's important that the system tracks these issues and alerts then also the corresponding stakeholders, because it's also an organizer in the background between the different areas that we just mentioned. It not just lets you sit there and you have to figure it out, but also tries to communicate or connect the people, connect the dots, right? So it takes a certain result from stakeholders' area of expertise, like I'm giving in feedback on my control, if it's really working or not, and it's taking that to the next stakeholder to essentially then assess if we're okay with that or not. Okay. And with that in mind, obviously you should be starting, as we mentioned at the beginning, prioritize your main risk and see that you connect them to your overall enterprise architecture or business architecture, and then scale it up, right? Scale it up so that then at some point you can also then potentially involve certain compliance and certain norms that you might want to accommodate or comply with, like some type of ISO norm or COVID or other norms that exist. Yeah, so.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of platforms, let's now see ADOGRC in action. Many organizations want to implement architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance, but aren't sure where to start. From your experience, what practical steps would you recommend to kickstart an ADOGRC program?
Yeah, so have a clear-cut indication of what are my assets, right? So these are my risks. These risks occur in this process, or they occur by using this application. So having this clear information, understanding that that's your main concern, mapping this, getting it in the tool, mapping it, connecting, creating a digital twin, essentially, of the scenario that you have in front of you, that certain risks are maybe occurring and are impacting certain processes, but you have it in a tool, which then allows you to also, within the tool, define responsibilities and roles so that people understand, well, I'm the owner of this risk. I have to give feedback on this particular assessment, or that person over there needs to give feedback on a certain control. So it's about clearly making sure who is going to do what are the responsibilities. Otherwise, things get lost. Obviously, when we have all of this and the workflows initiate, then there should be some type of mechanism to visualize, to have a dashboard to see and track how we've been doing, have we been successful in mitigating a certain risk or not, for instance. And then obviously from there, you expand it. You start off with your core priorities, but then you expand it as we go along. And then with that comes a certain culture, an improvement culture that happens then. That will be it, yeah.
That's a very practical roadmap. Start small, deliver visible value, and scale systematically. Integration is a major concern for organizations. How does ADOGRC work with existing enterprise resource planning, business intelligence, risk and compliance tools?
Yeah, so our tools in general, ADOGRC and the other products we have, they provide an API. This API is configurable, and it can be used to connect to any third-party tool that also offers an API. So that is definitely a procedure that we've in the past implemented. Certain clients have data in a certain tool, so you can sync it in, you can provide a connection so that then we have this seamless support, right? Then at the end of the day, ADOGRC would be then our source, where we have this kind of like connection across the different platforms. And it would be the source, right? It would be the source where we also then do our assessments and our work. as I said, there's these automated approaches. There's also other approaches to get data in. So there's from different file formats that you can import to object asset-based table imports into our tool. So there's various different ranges of importing mechanisms and connectivity mechanisms, right? With the API as mentioned, you can synchronize it automatically, but also then export the data in that sense. So we want to, at the end of the day, also make sure that at the end of the day that we have to have less duplication and to have less kind of like maintenance on different platforms, but by connecting them with each other, the data is stored once or created once, and then it's basically managed and synchronized to ADOGRC, for instance. So if you have, for instance, let's say applications on a CMDB somewhere, it can be then synced into ADOGRC so that then all the assets that you might be managing in your CMDB, they're always up to date and they get synced into ADOGRC, where you then do risk assessment on them.
Okay. Integration is indeed key. Without it, even the best governance risk and compliance program risk remain siloed. And this brings us naturally to seeing ADOGRC in action. Pablo, could you show us a short demo of how ADOGRC works in practice?
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll do that. Let me just share my screen here. There it is. So please let me know when you see the screen. It should be sharing now. I think it should be visible,
yeah,
right? Great. So let me
visible.
quickly go here full screen so that I have a little bit better. Before I start with kind of like the dashboards and the workflows and all that, let's have a very brief look into a meta model. Just to give you an indication of what I mentioned at the beginning, to not just look into our maybe risk pool and our risk catalog, maybe our control catalog, but also in that essence, the overall structure or different structures and scenarios, such as business, for instance, where we have a process here in its core with the process and the process diagrams. Maybe also it was here the application landscapes where we have application components, services, and so forth. But not only that, also, for instance, the organizational structures here, like, for instance, roles, people, kind of like stakeholders that are responsible. As we mentioned before, responsibility is very important here. Responsible for certain processes, maybe responsible for certain risks and so forth, right? But also organizational units, for instance, right? You notice that these are connected. There's these connection dots here over here in the strategy. We got also things like maybe initiatives. We got the control objectives, the performance indicators. So there's different assets in ADOGRC that allow us to not just look at the risk itself, but also in a more wider context. And we connect them to each other, right? So we would connect, for instance, we would create a process maybe. Let's go from that scenario where we consider a process, maybe just high level, not necessarily with all the activities that are happening and what decisions are being made, but just this is a process that we have in a company. And in that process, I might have, as you can see here, a certain risk that is happening in that process. So that is just the important part for me. So you might have some Excel sheet where you have your risk and you're assessing them, and you're also saying in what assets and what processes am I having that risk, right? Or am I assessing it towards? Same thing, you could have your risk and connect it, for instance, to your application, to different IT-related assets, right? So long story short, we have assets in ADOGRC that allow us to manage the corresponding asset itself. Like, this is the risk forgery, this is the control for a principal, this is the process, create a loan request, but also connect them very easily via drag and drop, for instance, right? So we can very easily do a connection from one on the other asset, and by doing this connection, we can then also have a better understanding. So just very briefly on this meta model, and then let's go now to a scenario here, to my governance, risk, and compliance scenario, where I see various different asset types that I'm here as a current user that I'm logged in here. So I'm kind of like a power user who has access to everything. So I'm not really kind of like filtering out stuff, but I could, if I wish, also filter out here different scenarios if necessary. Okay, for now, let's just keep it a bit more high level. So with everything, notice here, for instance, if I look at my risks, I'm able to see that I got 28 risks currently in my repository, right? I could have also, for instance, controls and other assets that are just really in my dashboard. Now, if I, for instance, click one such risk icon, I'm seeing here that I have different types of risks in different states. Notice here's a draft and a release state, right? So I'm able to, for instance, see in a kind of like tabular structure here for this current dashboard, a high-level overview of all my risks. What are the affected assets? Where is this risk currently happening? Are there any assessments that are being done on this particular risk? Are there any controls that are currently used to mitigate the risk? If there's various controls, I also see that there's 3 of them. I can click it. Obviously, everything's linkable here. So very clear for me to have an overview of where are my risks, or what state, first of all, are they in. So our assets here have a different kind of like state procedures of draft, released. When they're released or blocked, I can alter them, obviously, send it back to a draft. So there's this mechanism to have it clear. But what I can obviously then do, maybe going more into the assessment side of things, is looking into different types of risk that I might have here. Okay, so I notice here I already have 3 states. I have under assessment, I have here released and draft. And depending on my current asset that I'm looking at, if it's a risk assessment or control, or it's a compliance asset, I might have different stages there, right? So from such a high level view, I could, for instance, go in. First of all, I could obviously notice that there is also different attributes here in my table, right? So I can see that now in my assessment, I do have a likelihood and impact and detection side of things that calculate me a value at risk. So there's a predefined kind of like mechanism of logic that we have in our standard offering, which can be altered, right? So if necessary, these mechanisms on how to calculate or how to do the assessment can be altered. As you perhaps from your own expertise know, you might have a certain way to assess a risk with a scale from 1 to 10, or a color scheme, right? And we have also something that we put in here as a standard, but this can obviously then be altered to accommodate your assessment mechanism, right? Looking at the standard that I have here, obviously I can go in here, my filter, and select, well, show me please the ones that are very high and high, right? And so I'm seeing only the ones that are very high and high, for instance. So these tables allow me to get first of all, an understanding of where is my current assessment, when is it scheduled to be assessed again. So I see here that I can select various further elements in my table, such as, for instance, also the frequency of the risk assessment. So how often are we going to be doing this? So you see here there's a manual, a yearly, a monthly approach. So the tabular is one way to get a hold of this, and maybe understanding of which risks, as we mentioned at the beginning, we might have certain risks that we want to prioritize. So we get a hold of all the risks, we can import them, and we can assess them. And when the assessment maybe is done the first time, I see which ones have a high impact or a high value at risk. And those are maybe the ones that I want to focus on a bit more to track and to see if we can mitigate them. Or how are they impacting certain business elements, certain IT elements, right? Now, a good way is here to create a chart. So I'm selecting now my different states of assessments, and I have a data set from which I can then create various different visualizations. A very common and often used visualization is the so-called FMEA. So you can use predefined templates that we have here, but you can also create your own templates. Obviously, I can also then alter here attributes that I wish to use in order to create such an indication here, right? So I see that currently, let me just take away this one here that doesn't have any indication. And I see a very clearly defined structure here with a heat map. So these are my assessments that have been triggered back to me via the workflows. And I see which ones fall into a red category, meaning that they're very likely and the impact is very high. Notice here the bubble size, also the detection shows me that the detection here is very high, very moderate. So maybe I'm going to reverse the bubble size. So the bigger bubbles are the ones that maybe are not so good. So it's a very low detection, you notice up here, right? So also if there's various different assessments that land on the same kind of like likelihood and impact side of things, I can also use the third dimension here in order to get an understanding of it. Not going to go much into it, but you can also create a fourth dimension in that sense by using a color overlay up here. So you can add a fourth dimension to make a color mapping of your assets that are in the graph, which in this case would be also assessments here of risks. But let's now go into, for instance, one of them. Let's just go into maybe this one here, money laundering. So I see I want to focus on the ones in red. So this is where we also, one of the questions you had was, how does it help me, make benefits? How does it help me be quicker or gain something out of implementing in a GRC tool? Well, one of the things is having a better understanding of how your risk in this case are being assessed and where to prioritize. So I don't want to look into the ones in green, maybe also not the ones in yellow, but let's look at the ones here in the red area. So I'm going to maybe open up here the one insights of this particular assessment. So I'm looking now at money laundering. So I guess a very, very important risk that we should consider tackling, right? Notice on the left side here, I'm already seeing various different assets on which this particular risk, money laundering, is being used or not used, but the scenario happening is being there, right? So I see that there is a process that is in place where this particular risk is occurring. So the visualization we currently have here, this insights, allows me to see the overview, what we mentioned at the very beginning, not just looking at the risk itself and saying, well, you know what, this is nice. I know it's probably a bad risk, but now I also see where it's currently connected to. Right? And if I go on top of these little icons, you notice that I'm able to see here, these are essentially control objectives, right? And I can see that there are parts of norms. So I'm utilizing norms and I want to be compliant with certain norms, right? So this is one of the risks that is then also part of these norms that I'm need to tackle in that sense, right? Or I see also here, there's a process, as I mentioned, a process diagram, right? Notice that everything's connected, so I can jump into everything, and I can jump into the insights. The little icon here is the insights of the corresponding assets. So this is, again, something that allows me to be more transparent, to have a better understanding of our architecture. In this case, it's a multitude of architectures. It's the business side. I have my processes, but I also have here my IT, right? So I'm seeing that certain controls are being implemented here maybe in these applications, right? So I see the control and authorization by the supervisor is implemented within this particular IT application or IT system, right? So the overall understanding is there visually for me to see. Not only for me as a risk manager, as a kind of like final stakeholder who has to take decisions, but also for people who might be giving assessments on them, right? Because I might be somebody who is related to this particular process here, and I get then, in the course of the workflow, which we'll show in just a short moment, get notified that I need to work on this, right? If I go down here, I'm seeing also the progression over time. So I'm seeing, for instance, that there's been here 2 assessments done. One time it was 30, but it went up, right? So it looks like this particular risk is actually becoming a bit not so well. It's becoming worse in a sense, right? We want to have this kind of like drop down. So I could potentially go in and I could then get a better understanding of the controls, right? So let's go maybe on this one here. Let's see what is happening here in this control. I see that this control currently here is connected to actually other risks as well. So not only money laundering, but also theft of information, right? I see that there is a particular test for this control, and there's a value of effectiveness for this test here, right? There's also an execution of the control. So things are connected again. So I could have a control as a mitigation measure for this risk, and I see that it's being currently done. So it looks like this control might be going quite okay, right? So here I can also see that this one seems to be also working quite well. Here I already have a little bit of a less efficiency on this particular one, right? And control of authorization. I can see here that it actually, this control is mitigating various risks. So it seems to be a very important control, right? And I see also here that it was declined one time. So maybe this declinement of it was one of the reasons why I'm actually not getting a better mitigation here. Right? So it's about having a clear indication of what have people done in this particular case when they executed the control here of the control and authorization by the supervisor. Whatever has happened in the past, I can then also see in the workflow and the insights of the corresponding control execution here. So if I have one here, I can click it and I see that it was declined, right? So I can then select it and I can see here also reasons for why it was declined or why it was done and what were the corresponding reasons behind doing them or not, this particular execution. So let me just, in this particular example, submit this to execution manually. So I'm not going to wait now for the corresponding workflow to take place. So depending on how often we create this execution, it could be that the workflow happens, let's say, every quarter or every year. So I'm currently sending it to my corresponding perform for execution. Notice here now on the side, it changed its state, right? So now this is where I have my workflow. And then I can, for instance, now here as a person who's performing this execution, see here that there's an overview stage and an execution stage. I'm currently in the execution stage, and I can then here give feedback as to why maybe I'm not able to perform this. So not able to perform, for instance, because the system that I'm supposed to use is down, right? So I'm not able to perform it. I might have some other type of control that I might need to do here. There's a mechanism to also upload certain documentation. So maybe let's just very briefly, just for the heck of it, upload here something. Let's upload this PDF. Okay, so there's a PDF that's being uploaded as a kind of like reference documentation or maybe an evidence, right? And I can then decline it maybe if I wish to. I can execute it as well if I wish to, but now as I'm not able to, I might decline it. And what happens then is I do receive here my little button here, or little dot in that sense in my trend. So this is a very, very simple now, because the execution of a workflow, of a control execution workflow is quite straightforward. I see my button here, and in the history, I can also see here that it's been declined and what are the reasons. And here's, for instance, also the documentation as to why we're not able to perform this particular control. So it's about traceability and tracking, as we mentioned also in the very beginning. Imagine this now happening over the years, right? Over at least months, years. So you know what happened a year ago, you know why a certain control wasn't executed, or why, for instance, a certain assessment here was assessed in a certain way, right? Because everything's tracked in the history, which you can always check out here, the assessment history of our assets, right? Which then also obviously then creates these reports and these graphs. And then I'm able to, from there, if I notice that we're actually here in this particular case, running the risk of getting a higher value at risk, right? And there could also be a threshold that you set up here. So if it jumps by, let's say, 100, then there's an automatic notification to the corresponding risk manager, for instance. If that condition is met, then we would, for instance, go in here and create a so-called initiative, right? So initiatives are projects to improve. Sometimes you can also use them, or not sometimes, but very often they're used as initial mitigation measures to create a mitigation measure for a certain risk. But then when we have controls in place that are recurring mitigation measures, very often these initiatives are actions, right? That can be, for instance, ways to improve or improve maybe the control, right? So if our control was not working well because the application was down a lot, then we might need to migrate to a different application. altogether, or find a different solution because it's apparently not being able to be executed, right? So I could create this initiative, and when I create such an initiative, the nice thing about them is that they have a certain state and time. Now I just click one that doesn't have here a degree of completion, but the initiatives, I can also track what are they going to be essentially improving. So very likely here I would have maybe just my system and I want to migrate it, right? And then we can have here so-called reports where we track also the planned resources and times of the initiative, but also then can say, well, we want to maybe implement a new system across all of our laptops, but for that we need to have the user of the laptop also download this particular application. We have 100 laptops and maybe 50 have downloaded it, so we're at 50% currently. I can give us a status of that, and we're maybe going okay, everything's like planned. Maybe we're going to be wrapping it up sooner or later. I can give feedback on the costs and efforts, and then click on the report, and this will then generate for me again. This is about transparency and documentation of everything. It will then, at the end of the day, create here. You notice that it's 50%. We have then here our kind of like trend chart of our action, of our initiative, or of our little project that has been implemented to maybe improve a certain mechanism like a control. And then obviously here, everything's visible. People can see, by the way, this GRC guy is me. It's just a bad name, so it's just tracking me as GRC. But I can see when, at what time have I done this, these changes. And essentially, I could have also uploaded a document, right? So that then over time, if a year later you want to check what did we do in order to accommodate this change, I see all the steps here, and I can see also documentation, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Taking a look at the time also, I would say let's maybe jump to questions. Let's do that maybe. But from a perspective of, just to maybe give you like a final word on this, from a perspective of GRC as an architecture-driven system here, for which ADOGRC allows us to do, you can already see that we have different assets from different spectrums that can be created or imported in various different manners, right? Via APIs, via import templates, I can manually create them. So there's different approaches, and then it's about creating the connections. You can do simple drag and drop. Once everything is set up here, you initiate the workflows and have people then being notified. So the workflow, the dialogue is typically then also being triggered, and then a notification is being sent to the corresponding stakeholder who should, for instance, in my case, do the control execution. So I get notified via email. I then don't need to think or worry about when do I need to do a certain check, when do I need to do a certain assessment. 2 months from now, we have the big meeting and I need to do those and those steps. So the tool takes care of this communication and it sends it forward and creates the graphs and the reports so that then ideally stakeholders can click and see the status and then 1 week later click and see what has been updated to have a better understanding and to take decisions accordingly.
Okay, Thank you, Pablo. I particularly like the visibility and transparency, as well as the extent to which it can be very granular, and you can link even specific actions that are related either to a control objective as well as to a risk, the remedial risk. I like particularly that linkage, as well as the overall visibility of the entire process across different processes, across different risks, across different control objectives. Thank you, Pablo. That makes it very clear how ADOGRC indeed turns GRC from a reactive exercise into a strategic decision support tool. Now, would like to open the floor for questions. This is your chance, our audience, to ask anything, whether it's about ADOGRC features, risk mapping, compliance, integrations, or how Yellomind can help support your GRC transformation. Please feel free to share your questions directly in the chat, and we'll take them one by one. We'll take the first question. Thank you, Oluwasegun. The question is, how can GRC help with process control?
So maybe I kind of like skip that part. You're right. Maybe let's go here into my structure. And if I deactivate my filter, you notice that I have here also so-called business process diagrams, right? Process landscapes. So very common things that we encounter in the BPMN and the process spectrum, right? So I am able to, within ADOGRC, activate or create process models and landscapes, right? So I'm able to, for instance, click this, and then I'm kind of going a little bit into manual creation. And I can create here a business process diagram by using, for instance, swim lanes, using pools, and obviously our start events, tasks, and so forth, right? So I can then go in and create here my corresponding, very quick, let's just make it very quick here, process, which then allows me to have a clear, very well documented skeleton that then I can also, using different assets, accommodate, right? So if I, for instance, go into my repository, now I did not jump yet into the repository, but now let's quickly jump into my repository here, where I have all my objects, my assets, my models stored, this kind of like one central source of truth. And I have a couple of like dummy content here. And let's say, for instance, I have my IT virus here, right? So I can then assign it, for instance, to a task or also to a higher level process object, which then can also be then mapped within a landscape, right? And also notice there's controls in place here that I can then just simply say they're being implemented maybe in a particular task, right? So GRC allows me to really enrich the process, have these connections here, have the connections also. Let me just go here into my sample. Sorry, I gotta go here into my sample bank scenario that we always kind of like use. And here, let me see, there's my process landscape, a high-level process landscape that we have pre-created here. It's a kind of like a fake bank with some high-level processes, core processes, management processes, support processes. Obviously, you can create them also in different settings and so forth. But you notice already here, I'm seeing where my controls implemented. So I see, for instance, in my process payment, there are certain controls implemented, right? And there are certain risks implemented. So if I click on the risk icon, I see which ones are they, right? So I can click there. If I go into a drill down effect, I'm then seeing, for instance, a next level of my process financing. And now here, for instance, there is another process object with various risks. And now suddenly I'm focusing a bit more here on this particular process. And there I see a bunch of different risks that are occurring within it, right? And when I then click on it itself, I'm then able to see a more profound documentation. This is an example of a process that's way more worked out than the one that I had just a moment ago. But everywhere you see the risks, right? And you might have the controls implemented. So GRC helps me also to deal with all this business side of things, the process, the business assets, and connect the risk to them so that I clearly understand where and in what particular area and what particular task and what activity are certain risks occurring.
Okay,
right.
Thank you, Pablo. Another question, does ADOGRC align with and support compliance with banking sector regulations and supervisory requirements?
So to answer your question, yes. The question is obviously what type of regulatory framework you're looking at. One of the things I have not yet jumped into because of time constraints, but I guess I can jump into now, is the use of the so-called control objective, including the control assessment or control objective assessment. So there's a workflow for this, right? And you notice up here, I have a little extra area here where I can then see certain catalogs. So we at BOC, we have like a pre-configured reference framework, or let's put it this way, various different frameworks that we can import here and have a continuous basis of getting the new versions of this frameworks online or on the tool, right? And let me just give you an example. So if I, for instance, select here a filter, now I have a filter on actually, and you notice there's a bunch of them. Now it could be that some of them are not relevant to you and that you might need certain ones that we don't have here, right? It's about, if I, for instance, look at this one here, ISO 27001 here, version 2022, if I click on it, now I'm opening up my asset. I have not really gone into that, but I've opened up my asset where I manage this particular control objective or my compliance of ISO 27001. I see, for instance, where information about it is, and also how it's connected, or in what other control objectives does it contain. So obviously this one is a higher level one, so there's a hierarchy below it, and I can see the whole hierarchy, and things are connected to each other. I can click on them, and I have this kind of like predefined connectivity. Now, it must be said that we provide these frameworks there. They can also be imported quite easily. So if you have certain frameworks that you need, we don't have there, they can be easily imported, and they appear here as assets within ADOGRC in the repository. But it's about contextualizing. So you would need to contextualize in what processes, or in what IT systems, or in what other my users, my roles that are related to this particular framework or this compliance. So there is still the need to obviously connect the dots, but this can be definitely be used as a base to accommodate also regulatory frameworks in the banking sector, for instance.
Okay, excellent. Another question, and this is a question I had asked during our Q&A: does ADOGRC integrate with other enterprise systems such as ERP and CRM platforms?
So yes, let me just quickly go out here, out of my full screen. Let me go out. I have here a little link open. I'm not going to go much into detail, but we mentioned briefly there is obviously our tools, including ADOGRC, can communicate, right, to other sources. It's not just isolated. That's the whole approach. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be isolated. And here we have our API, which is part of the tool. It's free, so it's there. You very simply can activate it in ADOGRC and start connecting to other sources and pull data in, for instance. There's various different mechanisms on how to create this connectivity, right? Authentication measures, you notice there's different types of authentication measures you can use. So our documentation, long story short, is there, freely available. It's an online documentation that you can use to understand how our API works and use it to connect to outside sources, such as, for instance, a CRM or some CMDB or some other third-party tool in that sense. It does not limit the amount of data that's being transferred. Is not based on amounts of tokens you generate. It's part of the tool, and it's just about configuring it. But then it's kind of like free to use for you.
Okay. Thank you, Pablo. That brings us, on account of time, that brings us to a close of the Q&A session. Mm-hmm. And thank you again for that excellent demo. I would like to do a recap as we close the webinar. Thank you. So to recap what we've learned today, traditional GRC often fails because it's fragmented and reactive. As we've seen, architecture-driven governance, risk, and compliance links risks, controls, and compliance to enterprise architecture. ADOGRC specifically transforms governance from a static obligation into a strategic, proactive, and measurable capability. If your organization is struggling with disconnected risk management, low visibility, or compliance overload, this is the right moment to rethink your approach. We invite you to book a GRC diagnostic session with Yellomind and explore how ADOGRC can help your organization move from fragmented compliance to business resilience. You can book by clicking the link in the comments. Thank you all for joining us today. Stay tuned for the next episode of YelloTalks, where we will continue turning complex challenges into practical insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, guys.